Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Amila Golich, and I'm Assistant Director of Programs at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. We're delighted to welcome a great panel here today to delve into security and investment issues in Sub-Saharan Africa. I would also like to thank the Atlantic Council in Washington, D.C. for partnering with us to develop this program. Our conversations about this program were started earlier this year when the Atlantic Council released a report on the increasing importance of Africa to U.S. national security issues. I would encourage you to pick up a copy of that report, unless... Actually, I see you already have all picked up a report, so good job, guys. Turning back to today's program, please note that we are on the record and we are live streaming. We welcome your engagement on social media, but please make sure that your phones are turned on silent. Later, we will be taking questions from the audience through the microphones in the room, as well as through our online app, which you can find at chi.cnf.io. If you forget that address, that will be displayed on the screens to either side of me throughout the program. A brief disclaimer: for nearly a century, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs has provided an independent, nonpartisan platform for a variety of different perspectives to promote deeper global understanding and active U.S. engagement in the world. The views expressed by the individuals we host are their own and do not represent institutional positions or views of the Council. Finally, before I turn it over to our panelists, I would like to take a few moments to introduce them to you. In brief, Bronwyn Bruton is the Director of Programs and Studies and Deputy Director of the Atlantic Center's Africa Center. She's also a recognized authority on the conflict in Somalia and the Horn of Africa. Grant Harris is CEO of Harris Africa Partners, where he works with organizations doing business across Africa. He was also previously the Special Assistant to President Obama for African Affairs. Ian Solomon is a non-resident fellow at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. He's the founder of Solomon Global LLC, and he was previously an executive director at the World Bank Group, where he focused on increasing private sector investment in Africa. Unfortunately, our original moderator, Cassidy Walters from the Albright Stonebridge Group, could not be here today, but stepping in for her will be Alicia Black, who is director of the Council's Global Food and Agriculture Program. Alicia will also moderate the audience Q&A today as well. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our panel.
Thanks. Hi, well, good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. And I'm excited to be stepping in on this panel a little last minute. We have such an expert panel. This will be an easy conversation we hope to have. Before we dive in, I said that I wanted to take a little bit of a survey of the room. How many people here have ever been to Africa, visited? Okay. How many of you have lived in Africa? How many of you are African? Okay. Good. We wanted to know our audience, and if you're online and you feel like tweeting at us where you're tweeting from, I know sometimes we have viewers joining us from Africa. It's a little late for that to be happening, but let us know, or if, again, you've visited or have specific questions about different parts of the continent. I want to kick off with a question for you, Grant. We have a report here that many of you should have in hand, which is really asking the question, why does Africa matter? Why does it matter for our national security? Why does it matter for economic growth here at home? And our president just got back from a tour of Asia. I don't think Africa is featured terribly highly yet in the administration. What's the argument you're making in this report?
Sure. Well, thank you for having me. Thanks for the question. The fact that people might read a report on why Africa matters to U.S. national security is a bit of a sad statement in and of itself, and we're not going to be anxious to clear out the room immediately after this for the why Asia matters to U.S. national security discussion. That's the next panel. But I thought that it would be very helpful to put all in one place the many arguments and the many reasons why Africa is so directly relevant to U.S. national interests. We suffer in the United States from a bipartisan affliction of really underestimating Africa's importance in a national security world. I've worked in the White House twice. I've seen it among Democrats and Republicans, and also among the broader populace. We just don't learn enough about Africa in schools growing up. A lot of the media coverage is very negative, focused on Ebola or South Sudan. And the dynamism and the diversity and also the national security implications are not fully captured. And so the broad brush nutshell of reasons, which I know that we'll unpack and explore in the panel, is I think about it along three lines. First, you do hear a lot of the transnational threats, and it's true that ISIS and Al-Qaeda have affiliates and have been deepening their roots in the region, and you've got the threat of Ebola or pandemic or other issues that could easily travel across borders, could threaten Americans abroad and at home as well. But that's not the complete picture. And the second reason is really one of opportunity. And I think that Africa is incredibly important and will be increasingly important for U.S. economic competitiveness. Africa right now is punching below its weight in terms of being plugged into the global economy. It represents only about 3% of global GDP, but it's of increasing economic and political importance. And it's really the last frontier in many ways in terms of U.S. investment and where we need to be thinking about where global growth can come from and where jobs can be created. I know we'll talk about China and others, but China is making $50 billion a year off of its infrastructure projects alone in Africa. That's money, and those are jobs that I would prefer to see flowing more to the United States. And then finally, there are a lot of issues in which African states and African partnerships are incredibly critical in pursuing that have nothing to do with Africa in and of themselves. Just a case in point is North Korea. If you want to sanction a regime that is a direct threat to the United States, and if you want to cut off its access to hard currency, right now there are 30 African states that are trading with North Korea. We can't have effective sanctions. We can't have partnerships at the United Nations and in other fora if we're not investing in these relationships with African states and doing so in a way. So it gets directly at U.S. global leadership as well.
Great, thank you. Yeah, point well made. Maybe diving a little bit into the security issue. People often start conversations about Africa by pointing out Africa is not a country. It's made up of many countries and the regions, and the countries function very differently. As you look across the continent, I'm going to direct this to you, Bronwyn. What are some of the big security threats you see? And I know you've got specific expertise in Somalia and in the Horn. So could you talk about sort of the big picture and then maybe zoom in a little bit on that region?
Sure. Unfortunately, it would take a long time to talk about all of the security threats that are facing the African continent. But generally speaking, they're concentrated up. So in the Maghreb Sahel, you have a virtual hornet's nest of basically terrorist groups. And I call them terrorist groups even though, frankly, half of their activities, or more than half of their activities, are criminal in nature. They're involved in human trafficking and drug trafficking and all kinds of criminal enterprises. And these groups are associated both with the Islamic State and with Al-Qaeda. And the recent action in Niger, in which American servicemen lost their lives, is a testament to how much more important that region is becoming. Increasingly, too, we worry about the Horn in East Africa. Tanzania, Somalia, Kenya, Uganda, all of these countries, which are important for U.S. national security and also for our economic interests, have been heavily infiltrated by terrorist groups. And there's increasing worry that the two sides are going to converge. And my personal worry as I survey the continent, the area that isn't getting any attention at all really in the US press, is Ethiopia. Because Ethiopia has been a bulwark for the United States for a long time. And right now it's looking very, very shaky, very shaky. And I think the probability of that country experiencing great unrest to the extent that the government is not going to be able to control that territory is very real. And if that happens, then what you're going to be looking at is a swath of real instability from Somalia through Ethiopia up to Yemen. And that's going to communicate all the way across that northern swath of Africa, which is going to be a huge challenge for the U.S. And there's nowhere near enough attention on it.
Well, and before we leave that point, then I feel like it's worth pausing because Ethiopia is often talked about as sort of a darling in terms of the development they've seen, the rate of growth that they've seen. Can you talk a little bit about how that's been changing maybe in the last couple of years to result in this dynamic where you fear that loss of control? Because 5 years ago, I'm not sure we would have been talking about it in the same way.
Yeah, I have to tell you that I and a number of other Horn of Africa experts have been sitting in conference rooms for many years, and we always say that Ethiopia is going to collapse. And we've been saying it for so long that people have just stopped listening. But the reality is, like Mali, Mali was a democratic success story until it wasn't. And then everybody looked back and said, actually, yeah, it wasn't. And Ethiopia, I think The Economist recently called it a house of cards, where, they've had great economic success, but unfortunately it hasn't been widely distributed. And it's fallen victim to the problem that most countries in East Africa have suffered from, which is tribalism. It's got a certain ethnic minority that's done very well, and the majority have not.
Great, thank you.
If I can jump in because I'm not nearly as pessimistic, Bronwyn. I think, doesn't mean I'm right, because you know these security issues better than I do. But I think it's important when you're providing the facts, as you do very clearly, that we just recall that these are very narrow lenses of looking at things, right? So if you're looking at security focus, there are certain security threats across the northern parts of the continent. But I see a continent that is incredibly diverse, where, yes, we've been saying for years, and there are problems, and some will be overcome by humans working hard to overcome them, and some will elude the grasp of leaders to deal with them. And I'm always worried about us, too easily caricaturing, not that you're doing that, but caricaturing the continent based on the latest crisis, the latest, issue of Al-Qaeda. It's a big place. It's a really, really, really big place. And the threats that we're experiencing in the north might actually be not having a very big impact on many parts of the population and many of the opportunities in other parts of the continent. So just a caution that, as it's critically important to do what you do so well, and I think the report that you did, Grant, and the Atlantic Council supported was incredible public service by shining a light. But you're right, Grant, the fact that we have to say why Africa matters instead of why the Horn matters or why particular cities matter, and diving in, I think that will hopefully be the version 2 of your report that you'll be funded to do. Because I think that's the conversation we need to move to. So we're no longer talking about Africa as a risk and Africa as a threat, but talking about here are the concrete areas in geographic regions that are, really quite large as the United States, as large as Mexico, right? I mean, to some extent, North America has really deep security problems in parts of it. But we don't talk in that sense. We talk about countries.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Great point. Well, I'm going to take your lead. You said maybe we should be talking about cities mattering or specific countries matter. Why does Nigeria matter? Can someone take that question on and talk about the development, the way we should understand such a large and diverse country, including cities versus rural areas? Who wants to take that?
Sure.
So I'll start
Sure.
with one first answer, and then you all throw an answer in. It's huge. It's about 250, 300 million people. Right, so it's a very large country. So there are many very small countries in the continent. Nigeria is not one of them.
Right.
And it's also the population rate of growth is very, very high.
Right.
So 37 of the fastest 100 growing cities are in Nigeria.
Right.
I think that's a good point. If you look at the demographics as well, the population is growing so quickly. And by 2050, I think it'll be the 3rd most populous country in the world. And so if you're thinking about Nigeria as well, its role in the region geographically, and in the past it's been the region's 911 when a situation occurs in a neighboring country, Liberia or Sierra Leone or elsewhere. And it's traditionally had a powerful military for peacekeeping purposes, and for others it's an economic juggernaut. And of course you've got to take everything with a grain of salt in looking at GDP and looking at the data and statistics, but it's really the largest economy on the continent. And it's got a lot of natural resources and a lot of dynamism, including human capital related to tech and other sectors. And so Nigeria has vast untapped potential. The problem is that it's been so untapped for so long, and we've been talking about its potential. And so there are a group of us, and maybe we're in different conference rooms, I'm not sure. Maybe I'm in the Nigeria fan conference room, which is down the hall from you and your Horn of Africa friends. It has enormous potential. It's going to continue to be an incredible player, but there continue to be governance issues that have hampered its growth, not just corruption, but also an ability to reconcile the vast geography and diversity of the country, including with respect to the North and the South, traditionally spoken, in terms of trading off the presidency and some other dynamics that have made it difficult to really tackle some of the underlying issues. But I have great hope that these will be tackled.
Do you want to talk about the security situation in northern Nigeria, maybe?
Sure, absolutely. I also wanted to mention really quickly that the manufacturing situation in Nigeria is really interesting. I traveled fairly recently to Aba, which is a town that is called the Japan of Nigeria. And it's really astonishing that, you can go into basically a huge, I wouldn't call it a shopping mall, but a big collection of little stalls, and there are thousands on thousands of manufacturers, and if you take any pair of shoes and you plop them down, in half an hour you'll have a perfect handmade copy. It's astonishing.
Wow.
I mean, it's really hard to sort of describe how much diversity there is in Nigeria. And I say that particularly because when we talk about it, we're often thinking Lagos in our heads. But we have to recall that there are secondary cities in Nigeria that deserve as much attention, particularly from American investors.
Right.
And to go to your comment, it's not always about the thing that's foremost in our mind. The security situation in northern Nigeria is devastating. Boko Haram, which is an IS-affiliated terror organization, has killed more people than any other terrorist group in the world. The numbers of people that have been displaced, the violence, the sexual violence, the brutality against children, it's really a horrifying situation. And as Grant alluded to, it's a very complicated situation as well. We often have a tendency to talk about these kind of crises in terms of religious ideology, but the reality is that northern Nigeria has a slew of social and economic problems, and Boko Haram is itself a reaction to those economic tensions. And unfortunately, I don't have a good answer to suggest how they can be dealt with. But it's not the only security problem in Nigeria either. I mean, perhaps you, Grant, could talk quickly about the Niger Delta, which has impacts on the U.S.
Sure. It's certainly a complex situation in the north, but also in the Niger Delta as well, where, again, you have a center-periphery issue at its heart, where there are populations and communities that feel that they're not benefiting sufficiently from natural resources. They feel that they've been mistreated by corporations, by the government. And these tensions, if not dealt with properly, they quickly spin into the violence, as we've seen in Nigeria. I think that Bronwyn hit the nail on the head in looking at the complexity of what roots this violence. And Boko Haram is a perfect illustration. If you looked at these issues only through the lens of ideology or religion, you'd be completely missing the picture. And what you see particularly is there have been a lot of studies recently about interviews with those who've joined extremist groups, interviews and studies trying to understand what really underpins it. Economic grievances are a huge factor. Feeling mistreated by the state and a sense of injustice are huge factors. And in many places, including in northern Nigeria, those tend to predominate more so than religious ideology. Other studies have said in West Africa that you can recruit a youth to an extremist cause for as little as $800. And that's a scary fact. When we're looking at Africa overall, demographically, there's so much going for it. The median age of Sub-Saharan Africa is 19 years old. And you have hundreds of millions of youth that need jobs. You would need to create 35 million jobs a year until 2035 just to incorporate this population growth. That's the number one governance challenge for African leaders, I would say. Because if you get it right, then you truly can use words like demographic dividend, and you're talking about economic growth, you're talking about Africa being a quarter of the world's workforce in 2050, and by the way, markets that should not be ignored. But if you get that wrong, then you're talking about disaffected populations, increasingly connected populations, youth that have no outlet and that have a sense of grievance and can be recruited to these types of causes.
Right. Well, and I'm not going to focus much on agriculture today, but I can't can't listen to that comment and not mention that those youth are also still rural in Sub-Saharan Africa, which is not true in other parts of the world, and that those employment opportunities are going to be in rural areas or in those secondary and tertiary cities. And so there's my plug for agriculture is that it's actually a really important youth employment opportunity.
And something like 60% of the unutilized potential cropland in the world.
Yeah, arable land. There's huge opportunity for business investment in agriculture, and a lot of American companies are seeing that, but there's far more to be done. Speaking of investment, China. China, and not just China. We were talking backstage that China and Africa is a story that's been talked about now for quite a while. I learned something new today, which is that Turkey is on the rise also in Sub-Saharan Africa. So I might throw it open to see who wants to take the first question, which is what's the general trajectory of Chinese investment? And I would also add, is there a change in the perception of Chinese investment that's been taking place over time? So I feel like the narrative has shifted a little as I've watched it. Obviously, it's country specific, but can you take a couple of examples of Chinese investment, either by sector or by region, and talk about how it's been changing?
I think it's your turn to talk, isn't it?
Okay.
So observing Chinese investment, I think I've observed an evolution, as you've talked about. I think it's actually an encouraging evolution. I think there's been a growing sophistication by African governments in striking better deals for themselves and for their citizens. And I think what I've observed is that the Chinese are smart business people. They will take what you let them take, and they will negotiate as hard as they can for access to resources, for access to land, for employment opportunities for their citizens. And I think we've seen, in some cases, there's been a very strong pushback from the local populations not liking the deals that the government struck, and you have seen an improvement over time in them. I think that's encouraging. Certainly, as Grant talked about, the level of investment is striking, particularly when you look at how little the U.S. by comparison shows up in Africa. So this is a fundamental shift, I think, in the resources and the interconnections between people, between economic opportunities that has taken place. And now, China has to be taken much more seriously than the U.S. does on the continent. And I think the U.S., from a security perspective and a relationship perspective and an opportunity perspective, needs to be saying, have we fallen behind vis-a-vis other parts of the world? And I think the answer is yes.
Do you want to take the question on Turkey, since you were educating me behind backstage?
The Turkish model in Africa is a really fascinating one, and you see it a lot. One version of it in Somalia, where the Turks have gone in and they've constructed schools and they've constructed hospitals, and they've really tried to be seen as a partner to the Somali people, and they've had some real successes there. Increasing, though, you see a lot of Turkish investment on the African continent, and it's nascent, but it's very definitely creeping in, and there's great interest in the construction field and banking in particular. And again, it's a lot of it's actually funneled through Morocco, which has been increasingly acting as a gateway to investment in Africa for European and Middle Eastern investors. And so it's definitely worth keeping an eye on. And the model is a more cooperative one than the Chinese model, for example.
Grant, I have to ask you, you were a big part of the big African Leaders Summit that was held in the U.S., which triggered a great deal of commitment to African investment. Can you talk about what you think what you think that did? What did that mean for those leaders that came here? How did that change the way that maybe American companies look at the continent, even if the U.S. government is not maybe taking a lead role right now on African investment?
Absolutely. In 2014, President Obama hosted the first U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit. And a key piece of that was a CEO forum, which was really unparalleled in terms of previous U.S. engagement. The caliber, the level, the size, the depth in terms of African CEOs, American CEOs having very serious conversation. All in all, the summit produced $37 billion of new trade, investment, other commitments related to Africa. And so it was on a scale that the U.S. had not achieved before, but other countries had, and had regularly had summits with African states, had regularly been pursuing this. One of the reasons there were a few reasons, of course, that President Obama did this, and the reasons that I suggested it, though, was that I thought there was an opportunity to send a very serious message in terms of U.S. trade and investment, because the simple act of hosting those leaders, the simple act of having the deal signings to portray Africa in a different light was partly meant to break through the noise. As I mentioned, the media coverage, a lot of the stereotypes, the misconceptions. One problem that we have in the United States is that U.S. investors tend to misperceive risk when it comes to Africa. And Ernst & Young does its annual survey of investors. They find that those who are investing in Africa, doing business there, they're more positive, they're more bullish than those investors who are not. And when you're talking about weighing risk, it's not that there isn't risk, it's not that there aren't difficulties in doing business, it's that there are risks and difficulties in doing business in any frontier markets. And Africa is not unique in that regard. There's no lock on governance challenges or corruption or other things that dissuade some U.S. investors. So one primary purpose of that summit was to send that message very loud and clear and to get more investment. And a lot of those deals that were inked ranged from sectors, but really got U.S. companies that hadn't been thinking about it as much, or that took their investments to the next level. The other issues that were raised, though, particularly in the closed-door meetings, went to governance. It went to how you create an investment climate that's going to attract capital. We all know that capital is cowardly, and it's going to flow to the places that most warmly receive it in terms of rule of law and in terms of certainty of recouping not just your returns, but of having a judicial process that if something goes wrong, all these standard reasons. We were trying to get at this through a different lens of what are the economic goals, the development goals that we're collectively seeking to achieve, but how can you get that without this capital, this investment climate? You can't. Okay, then what steps do we need to be working on together? How can we be supportive as well? And it was a very sophisticated conversation that was not a we know best. It was not it was a humble, we've got a shared goal. How can we be figuring out the policies that work?
The other thing about, I think, the work that you did that was so interesting was you said leadership is not just heads of state who are increasingly very old men. There are maybe 2 women in the mix, but they're also getting pretty old. And it said that leadership needs to be defined younger and in much more diverse ways, including bloggers and journalists and the CEOs you talked about, and so changing the notion of how we relate to a continent, not just between retiring revolutionaries, but entrepreneurs and people who are trying to carve new things. That was a really important signal that Obama sent with that summit.
Agreed.
We're starting to get quite a few questions online, so I'm going to pretty soon be opening it up to the audience and also taking some of these online questions just to remind everyone, if you want to submit them, use conferences.io and get them on the list. But before I do that, we haven't talked about Southern Africa, and today is a big news day in Southern Africa. So for those of you who've not seen, there is very likely a coup underway. I say very likely because I think the military is saying it is not a coup, although the head of state is in house arrest right now. We were talking backstage about what it means, and it's pretty hard to guess. But for those of you who, I'd love to hear any of your thoughts on Zimbabwe right now.
Sure.
It's so shocking. It's hard to even know what to say about it at this point. I grew up in Botswana, and I used to hang out in Zimbabwe a lot, especially back in the 80s. And Mugabe was the president back then. It wasn't recently.
The oldest world leader, right? 93, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's an earthquake, basically. But for those who haven't been following it, essentially there's been a succession battle playing out in Zimbabwe for the last few years. He has a younger wife who used to be his secretary, whose nickname is Disgrace. Her name is Grace Mugabe. And he had a vice president named Emerson Mnangagwa, who was very popular as a liberation leader, especially among the military. And Mugabe recently sacked him, apparently to smooth the succession path for his wife, and the military has apparently rejected that decision, which shows that Mugabe is not actually as much in control in Zimbabwe as many people thought. The situation right now is very unclear. He appears to be under house arrest, and the military, probably to avoid the perception of a coup, which would have dire political consequences for Zimbabwe, is saying that he's still in charge. But we don't really know, and we don't really know what this is going to look like. I don't want to monopolize the conversation, so.
I think that is exactly right. During my 4 years at the White House, I dealt with multiple coups, including the 3 a.m. phone call about what was happening in Mali, to the example that you were talking about. And I haven't ever written down a playbook of determining when there's a coup, but if the military takes over a broadcaster and declares that there has not been a coup, that would be on my playbook. So that's one indication that if it looks like a duck, quacks like a duck. I think the house arrest point is interesting, and it is very fluid and evolving. We'll see what happens. I think that if Mugabe was smart and preservationist, he would strike a deal that would give the former Vice President Mnangagwa the opportunity essentially to come back in. And I think Mugabe's hand is being forced by the military right now, but he may emerge in a way where he claims that it wasn't a coup and that it was more consensual than it appears to be. But right now, when you're under house arrest and when the military is calling the shots, that doesn't tend to denote a consensual process.
There are a number of questions also about his current mental capacity.
Sure.
And there have been a couple of examples over recent months of him exhibiting the sorts of characteristics of someone who may be suffering forms of dementia or other mental incapacity. So for him maybe getting forced, then who knows how much he's able to engage himself.
Before we leave Zimbabwe, we actually have a question on the Conferences.io platform that says, can you talk about how the recent unrest in Zimbabwe may affect the rest of the region? So any guesses you want to make there?
If I was in South Africa, this would be first on the plate of issues. If you think about the dynamics, and you saw this growing up, as well. You've got many Zimbabweans working in South Africa, many undocumented, but it's an important part of the economy. There's a South African fear of collapse or massive unrest that would increase refugee flows across the border. It's going to dominate the agenda in Southern Africa for that reason, partly because the Zimbabwean economy has imploded in the past, and you see the effects reverberate in other states, particularly in South Africa. And I think that behind the scenes, you've got leaders talking about what the way forward might be, worried that you're going to see this instability spread, which sometimes, and unfortunately in other cases, tends to sweep things beneath the rug in terms of Zimbabwe's last elections, for instance, or basically governance in Zimbabwe generally. There's a proclivity towards short-term solutions that are perceived as increasing stability over getting at systemic fixes. So I think there's a lot of concern in Southern Africa right now in that regard.
Although, just to play devil's advocate, we have to remember, too, that Zimbabwe's been in crisis since 2005.
Sure.
And a lot of the people who had the capacity to leave Zimbabwe have done it. And so I think that possibly refugee flows might be smaller than you would otherwise expect.
You also have maybe it's diminishing now, but a tradition, you call it stability grant, it may also be blind loyalty. And I think that, Mugabe played a big role in supporting the African National Congress and the liberation movement in South Africa. So the sense of we can't really criticize him that much. We need to be somewhat restrained in how much we engage Zimbabwe on some of the significant economic and human rights and other political challenges they faced. So the question is, will this now enable a more honest conversation between South Africa and Zimbabwe about the way forward?
It is going to be very interesting to see what Mugabe does. We have to keep in mind that for all of the suffering that he's put Zimbabwe through, he's still a liberation icon. And I think he is going to have to bless whoever winds up in power in that country, or else there's going to be real violence.
I'm going to move to one more specific kind of country question, and then we'll open it up to the floor. So get your questions ready here in the room. Rwanda is another country that people like to talk about in terms of the impressive record of growth, and certainly in the agricultural space, we talk about Rwanda all the time. There's been huge investment from the public sector, a real effort to make the private sector welcome, I would say. But there are plenty of critics that would say that Paul Kagame's record on human rights and other issues is perhaps leaving something to be desired. How should people be thinking about the sort of duality of his leadership, but he's not the only one that I think you could point to in that regard. And how does U.S. policy think about that, maybe since some of you've played a role in the U.S. policy attitude towards Rwanda?
I think it's so hard. I think that, and as you were talking about Rwanda, I was also thinking about Ethiopia.
Yeah.
Rwanda is a post-conflict country. They suffered a genocide, a terrible genocide, in which so many people, 800,000 people died. And in the aftermath of an event like that, they were fortunate to have Paul Kagame. He has stewarded the country, and he has kept it stable. But it's a knife's edge, because on the one hand, you want to make sure that there's enough authority on the part of the state to prevent conflict, but also if you squeeze too hard, then eventually you have an explosion. Yeah. And I think that's the problem. When I look across the continent at Rwanda and Ethiopia, I fear an explosion more in Ethiopia than I do in the Rwandan context. But I certainly have Rwandan opposition acquaintances who would argue that what Kagame is doing is actually setting the course the country on a course for additional conflict. And I think it's hard to say. But certainly the economic gains that Rwanda has made have been very impressive.
Yep, absolutely.
I think it's sometimes tempting to want to identify other countries or other leaders as good or bad, as friends or enemies, as, okay, they're either, they're pro-human rights or, and I think Rwanda is a great example of it's really complicated. Yeah. Right? You see improvements on issues of gender and women participating in the parliament, and you see real efforts at very kind of what I might consider progressive legislation and efforts to really modernize an economy and deal with a horrific genocide and address issues of ethnic conflict in ways that other countries could only dream of doing, that are all very, very positive. And then yet you see a worrisome, what is the succession plan here? Is this sustainable beyond this individual? And is there thinking about that? And I think it's a great example of we have to, as the U.S. and as a global partners, think about how do we support what's good and encourage what's good, and how do we figure out ways to chastise or to suggest or nudge on the things that aren't so good, and recognize that's the nuance of foreign policy, even if our current White House doesn't always see things that way. Nothing is ever kind of, they're bad, they're good. And I think we're actually starting to wake up to that in this country too, with this administration, like, they're not, we can't just beat up on people and expect them to do the things we like.
Yeah. Anything you want to add, Grant?
I think that nuanced explanation is exactly right. And we need to approach Rwanda or Ethiopia, we, meaning the U.S. government, not that I speak for it anymore, but as you were talking about how we see it through a policy lens, we need to be sophisticated and think about three-dimensional chess. And Rwanda and Ethiopia, it's no different in terms of navigating relationships as we do with Saudi Arabia or countries around the world where we have security partnerships or governance concerns or many things going on in the same time. We've managed to be sophisticated, and in many other cases we need to ensure that we always are, and that Africa is no different in that regard either. I think where we fall short sometimes is when we tend to look at a situation through one lens. To Ian's point, not just about a leader, but some constituencies only thinking about one angle or one policy imperative and not the others as well. And the policy-making process can't afford to do that. It's the same reason that you have a security partnership and you're complete partners on peacekeeping and regional stability and development and gains, and at the same time, as partners, then you've got to be candid and talk constructively about those areas of concern. It's not complicated in theory, but in practice, it's incredibly difficult in balancing those imperatives.
Great point. Okay, I'm going to open it up to the audience now. We'll have about 20 minutes for questions, maybe a little less. Does anybody want to take the first question? Otherwise, I can take one from online. Great. Up here? Just one moment till the mic gets to you so our online viewers can hear.
I'm Brendan. Does anyone want to just give an example of any recent success stories that might be overlooked? Just give us an optimistic example.
So quickly, I think in terms of, I don't think I have my phone on me, but mobile banking and financial transactions by phone, East Africa is far and away leading the world and way ahead of the U.S. So you see levels of financial technology innovation in Africa, in Kenya, that, and lots of apps being developed and a youth technology culture and people no longer wanting to grow up to be government civil servants like they used to be, now wanting to be technology entrepreneurs. I think that's hugely promising for the region.
That's a great example.
Can I ask a follow-up question, which is, where is Silicon Valley today in Africa, and where will it be in 10 or 20 years?
That's a good
If you
question.
had an equivalent.
It must be somewhere in Nigeria, though.
I would say there's probably a fight
Lagos and
between,
Nairobi are
I was going to say, I
competing
think
about
Kenya,
this.
Nigeria, but I've heard recently there's an effort in Kigali to see if they can stand something up.
Yes.
So that's why I was begging the
There
question to see if
definitely
you've heard others. Yeah.
But there can be more than one.
Of
in
course,
place
it's a
as
big
as
place,
this.
big continent.
Yeah.
Right. I think in terms of U.S. Silicon Valley as well, relating it back, there's some companies that completely get it. Facebook, Google,
Yeah.
others, they recognize demographically, economically that these are critical markets. They're making a very serious play. Mark Zuckerberg had traveled out. They're making investments both as individuals and also foundations in a lot of this tech, in entrepreneurship, in this ability. There still, though, are far too many companies where Africa's not figuring in or not on their radar. And I think that you will see more of that from other companies in Silicon Valley over time. And Africa, as we mentioned, again, we're generalizing it across just to make a point, but it's increasingly connected. And just last week, the latest study thinks that it's going to double in mobile broadband connections to over 1 billion in 5 years.
Wow.
And we're talking about a growing middle class, regardless of how you define that, and there's a lot of debate, but increased consumption, power, and a hunger and dynamism and human capital, that there's natural opportunities here. And smart countries and smart cities are positioning themselves in that regard too. Kenya was visionary in the investments that it made in ICT, and in many places there you can get on the internet and have faster speed than you can in my hometown here in the United States.
Yeah. Great point. Another question from the audience. Yeah, we have 2 over here. So we'll start in the front row and then go to the second row.
One question's always intrigued me is why would there be so much Turkish investment in a country like Somalia? Is this all public funds, or are these private investors, and why are they more willing to take a risk than, say, an American investor?
You started on Turkey. Do you want to add to it, or should we?
Well, I mean, just briefly, I think the charitable work and the business investment are linked. Basically, the Gulen Foundation, for example, has funded a lot of these schools and hospitals. And what they do is they go in and they create a strong link between, in theory, and often it works, they create a strong link between the Turkish people and the Somali people, and that paves the way for business investment down the road. So the two are closely tied, and that's, I think, really at the heart of the Turkish strategy, if there is one.
I'd love to add to that as well, and I think it relates back to China and economic potential on the continent overall. China has been renowned for its economic play, and I mentioned how much Chinese companies are making off of infrastructure, but just last year in 2016, China more than doubled its foreign direct investment in Africa, and the value of those projects are 10 times those of US projects. So the trend line is really off to the races, and China overtook the United States as Africa's largest trading partner all the way back in 2009. So China is making a huge play, which, by the way, is not just economic, but it translates into political ties, military ties, and it's all self-reinforcing. But China's not the only one that we're at risk of having our lunch eaten here in Africa in terms of US companies seizing the potential. Turkey's making enormous investment in Somalia, of course, but also they're looking to have an embassy in every country across the continent. Somalia is going to be their biggest one, which is quite a statement, but they're improving also. Turkish Airlines flying to multiple cities. Mm-hmm. They're making investments on a grander scale, and it's not just them. It's also Japan, it's also Brazil, mm-hmm. It's also the UAE. It is around the world a collection of players that see Africa in terms of through an economic lens that we've been a little bit slow to realize in this country.
Yeah, India and Russia as well.
What's that?
India and Russia as well.
Absolutely.
And part of it is that, to go back to your question, is it easier for them to envision investing in Africa than it is for American businesses? And I think the simple answer to that is yes. Grant mentioned the way that American companies tend to overemphasize risk when they're looking at African markets. But also, it requires a different manner of doing business and a lot of problem solving. And the data isn't there. A lot of the times when American businesses want to go in someplace, they want to see a neighborhood by neighborhood data breakdown of incomes and shopping habits and the like, and that just isn't available right now. And that makes it harder for them.
Also history. I mean, Turkey's been a trading capital for long before the U.S. was a country. So we are a very young country here, and I think this notion of kind of whether this the Silk Road or whether it's kind of Istanbul markets, these have been hubs of lots of dynamism that I think are in some ways want to revert back to their historic positions.
Yeah. There's a question in the second row here.
So you guys discussed a lot about success in telecom and finance as the growth markets in this region. Do you see this region skipping the industrial revolution as a whole and going from an agricultural to a service country?
Fascinating question.
Yeah.
You do?
Well, I hope so.
You should go first then.
Personally. I mean, it's what I meant when I said yeah. I said, yeah, great question.
Okay.
I worry about the idea of African manufacturing because it relies so much on infrastructure. And I don't know who's going to pay to build it. Africa needs billions and billions and billions of dollars worth of roads and electrical grids and all kinds of things. And I'm heartened that Chinese investment is increasing because if China isn't funding it, I don't know who will. I don't see the United States being able to engage in that kind of, what would basically be a Marshall Plan for Africa. And I have to say, I think that, as you mentioned, Ian, the tech explosion in Africa, the mobile banking and 3D technology and artificial intelligence and other things that you're seeing emerge on the African continent suggest that, in my very non-specialist opinion anyway, that's a more promising kind of pathway for Africa to the extent we can talk of, it's not a country. But to me, I think that that's a more promising model than to think that manufacturing and low-wage, low-skilled work. I just don't see that really being a successful path for the continent, personally. But again, it's anybody's guess, and I wouldn't invest in my opinion, so.
I think there's some places where there's the opportunity to skip over technologies. I would not advise any company to just say, landlines in Africa, that's going to be the next big thing. It's all that's been skipped definitively. We're all about mobile phones. But I'm much more reluctant or hesitant to think that we will see a vast transformation so quickly away from agriculture or to the age of manufacturing. Particularly, as was noted, agriculture is at the heart of most economies in Africa. More than 2/3 of Sub-Saharan Africans make their living off of agriculture directly. And it's a critical element. And frankly, though, there's a lot of room for increased productivity there and great investment potential.
Yeah.
But that's much different than a factory manufacturing play. Some countries, and this again goes back to the mixed bag, Ethiopia, for instance, has been really strategic and forward-looking about manufacturing and about an economic strategy and about making use of trade preferences, and the policy commitment among countries vary. But it's going to take an all-of-the-above strategy to create the jobs that are needed for African youth and to create the economic growth. And it will not be done with public sector financing. As Bronwyn mentioned, there's a $50 billion a year gap in infrastructure funding that needs to be filled. That's going to need to be filled predominantly with private capital. And all of that is going to go back to the investment climate in the many different markets and countries in Africa, which varies substantially. And the policies that improve the investment climate and attract capital, those are the ones that will yield jobs. But a lot of them will be in agriculture, some will be in manufacturing, some will be in tech. It'll be a vast array.
Anything you want to add to that, Ian?
I think there will be many different pathways that different African countries and cities take, and there will be elements of manufacturing and elements of agriculture and new forms of agriculture and packaging. So I don't think the old story of industrial revolution that swept through Europe, we're going to see anything like that. We're not going to see landline phones in many places.
Right.
And I think it's important for the policy community to be really humble about the advice we give about economic growth, and I say that as a former person who's worked for the World Bank. There's no one model for all the different groups of people and all the different economies in all the different regions. So let's not dictate another industrial revolution or a tech revolution or an agricultural revolution. Let's try to create the conditions where entrepreneurs in the private sector and leaders from all sectors can emerge and actually try to compete to define Africa's own future for themselves.
I have to just add a footnote on the Ethiopia comment, which is that the Ethiopian Commodity Exchange Executive Director was in Chicago last December, and I had a quick conversation with him and said, I haven't been to Ethiopia in a year or two, tell me what's going on. And he talked about the manufacturing sector and said, well, do you know that the cost of labor is getting way too high in China and Vietnam? We will be China and Vietnam, give us 10 years.
Right.
And he noted for me that Ivanka Trump's shoe factory is in Ethiopia, in fact, fun fact. And then he also talked a lot about, in fact, not surprisingly, import substitution and how Ethiopia wanted to be self-sufficient in agricultural production and in a lot of other goods that they wanted to manufacture. And there's a couple questions here that relate to the resilience of African economies so that they're more resilient to the boom-bust cycle of different commodities. There's also a question here about reliance on agricultural imports versus being self-sufficient internally. I happen to believe that it's going to be a blend of both for a while. But to this question about resilience, which countries are focusing more on maybe it's not one or the other, but trade versus self-sufficiency, trying to increase productivity deliberately and thinking more like Ethiopia? Are there countries that run the gamut there that we could talk about?
I have to jump in a little bit if you don't mind.
Please.
And I'm sorry, pardon my cold. We talk a lot about Ethiopia as a model and self-sufficiency, for example, but Ethiopia had what's essentially a famine.
Right.
And has millions and millions and millions of people that are dependent upon food aid and will starve without it. So we have to be really cautious about how we talk about the Ethiopian model.
I take that point, although they did not meet the famine criteria and wasn't on the famine risk this year. And in fact, their resilience to the shock that the other countries experienced was better, and there's data to show that. But I think you're right. I mean, they're focused on that because they've experienced multiple famines, right? They're focused on trying to make sure they can get off of that food aid. So whether it's agricultural resilience or broader economic sort of resilience? Are there countries that have more of an externally facing strategy versus a regional or internal productivity strategy, I guess, is the question that seems to be coming up.
I'm not sure I know. My impression is that most are
Trying the blend approach.
and want to open up to other markets and other investors. And if Turkey's interested, if China's interested, if the U.S. is interested, they're quite eager. Yet they also realize they do want to, many of them, and I don't want to generalize completely, but also build their own internal capacity and their own internal sectors. That's my instinct based on the countries I've worked with.
That sounds right to me. And there has been a big push on increasing trade in particular. And one of the sad facts, going back to infrastructure, but also policy issues, is that intra-African trade is extremely low. It's more like 10, 15% of trade compared to Europe, which is over 60%, Asia, which is much higher. There isn't enough trade within the continent, and it's often cheaper to ship product to Europe or elsewhere than it is to ship it to your neighbor as a neighboring state. And the breakdown, though, is in political will. And there's a lot of rhetoric about breaking down these barriers and harmonizing borders and consolidating and increasing market size, which would attract much greater investment as well. But oftentimes the implementation is much slower, and there are things beneath the surface within the region about what's going on. At the same time, each government would say as well that they're focused on building domestic industry, and Nigeria has been very focused on wanting to end import of rice. There are specific policies that different countries can point to. So I think it is a blend. They will say all of the above, but in practice, you've got to have the political will there, of course, to seize the right policies. Nigeria, the government also talked a bigger game about diversifying the economy when oil was much lower and trading at a lower price per barrel, but still the action wasn't sufficient to the need.
Yeah. I'm going to take one more question from the room. Brian, you had your hand up, and you're the first on this side of the room. Brian Hansen, our Vice President of Studies.
Hi, I want to ask a question about the relevance of U.S. policy in two respects. One respect, how important is it for African growth? You're talking about China is already playing a very big role, the role of the private sector. Is this position of the U.S., and this administration has shown no real interest in engaging in Africa, is that problematic for Africa in terms of economic growth? And secondly, does U.S. policy and the role the U.S. plays in the region matter for U.S. businesses to be able to participate effectively in African economies?
I'm going to jump out of my chair on this one. Those are great questions. I think there are a couple of things that I would want to say. U.S. policy is important, but probably not as important as current and former U.S. policymakers would like to think that it is, myself included. U.S. policy, though, toward Africa has been relatively consistent until now, and I'll come back to that. President Bush, President Clinton, President Obama, the policy was fundamentally the same, looking at strengthening democratic institutions, peace and security issues, economic growth, and development. The puts and takes have been towards individual countries on individual issues, responding to different issues. But the frame and the view has been along those lines and shifting and evolving over time from one of aid and assistance to trade and aid, and slowly realizing the economic potential and the political importance of the continent. So from a U.S. perspective, as I was describing in the opening, relationships with African states are incredibly important, more important than most people realize. And we're losing out in terms of influence as we let those relationships wane. I mentioned China's play is multifaceted. There have been multiple times since 2009 where China has defeated UN resolutions related to human rights and only dependent on the help of African states voting to shoot them down. That's not as simple as just an infrastructure investment, but it's an array of relationships and incentives. So the relationships are quite important. U.S. policy is highly important as it relates to promoting trade. U.S. policy that provides tariff-free access to U.S. markets for many states, that can be an incentive, though it's not fully utilized. U.S. policy is taken very seriously by many African partners, and we also have been traditionally a big supporter of peacekeeping operations, of conflict resolution in many different ways. At the same time, though, now we are seeing a fundamental break. And this isn't a partisan comment. President Bush was phenomenal in terms of Africa policy and his beloved across the continent, his investment in recognizing that HIV was ravaging and decimating African states, and his investment there, or creating the Millennium Challenge Corporation. But with President Trump, there is less attention being paid to Africa overall. There have not been appointments to key positions, and so there's rudderless policy, in many ways lack of clarity. And there's a greater emphasis on security tools where we're de facto militarizing our policy in many ways. And it's not that those military tools aren't important, it's that they need to be concomitant with investments in governance and getting at the systemic solutions to what's going on. It's not enough to sell helicopters in Nigeria. You need to be, as a policy matter, rolling up your sleeves, encouraging solutions and a holistic approach, funding reconciliation activities, looking at governance issues. You need to be doing all of the above again. Last point, and I apologize for going on at length about it, how important, you ask, is U.S. government action towards companies? It's not determinative in many ways, but it is important in sending signals, first of all. We found when we were in the administration trying to increase conversation and cross-pollination at the CEO forum and in these fora, that it was breaking through the news cycle a bit. It was getting more people talking about it. It was setting a tone in terms of Africa being thought of through an economic lens. But the tools do matter. Over the course of the Obama administration, agencies like the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, the U.S. Trade and Development Agency, they significantly increased the amount of their portfolio in Africa. And that translates into political risk insurance, financing tools, technical advice, matchmaking, relationship building. Those things do have a direct impact in helping companies that are looking to do business across the continent. The U.S. is not where it should be or needs to be in supporting companies, and it will not be the determinative issue in assessing risk. But the level of U.S. support, the tools available, the reliance on commercial advocacy and having embassies be helpful when a deal goes wrong or is slowed, those things can be very helpful and make the difference in certain cases.
I would
Want to add?
push back a little bit. I'm not as convinced as Grant is that there's that much of a difference between Trump and Obama on Africa policy. Certainly the disorder that's plaguing the administration, especially in regards to staffing, is unusual. But Obama's Africa policy was MIA for many years, and a lot of Africans complained about it. They had such high hopes when Obama, whose father was Kenyan, came to power. They really thought it would presage a much more activist relationship between the U.S. and Africa than it did. I'd also say that although President Obama spent a lot of time talking about African governance and human rights, he was quick to throw it out the window when counterterrorism concerns came into the play. You know, in the Somalia intervention, for example, the U.S. put millions on hundreds of millions of dollars into bankrolling Museveni in Uganda, the Kenyan army, which was committing hideous human rights abuses right and left, the Ethiopian army, which, I mean, its invasion of Somalia basically created al-Shabaab. These kind of actions, although Trump has certainly been more blunt about it, are not new. And I would say that, you know, although yes, he's less interested in Africa for sure, he's not much less interested, would be my perspective.
I think we need to have a separate session.
I know, I feel like it's just getting pretty exciting here. Maybe this will continue over drinks.
I'd be happy to discuss it at greater length.
We've talked about this before.
We'll be friends on all other topics, yeah.
If I may just so, you know, I'm probably going to side with Grant in that debate, but it's not just what things we've done, it's also the idea of the United States. Right? Many people don't forget how diverse individual countries in Africa actually are. And we are an experiment, an example, an aspiration of a diverse country that manages to get along and prosper. So to some extent, I think many people I come across in different parts of the continent, they want the U.S. to be their model of growth and development and of an integrated society for all of our flaws and all of our faults. And I think there's a real worry as they see the U.S. faltering and showing its own versions of tribalism take root and grow and perhaps get, you know, support. There's a sense that maybe that's not the model. Maybe these other models are actually more promising for us. And that's where we need to kind of succeed here so we continue to be a model and then figure out what's the precise policy mix to share with the content.
I think that's exactly right. And you can't talk only about Africa policy as well when there's an administration budget that would decimate the State Department, decimate assistance, have global impact. But the signals we send are important. And corruption is one of them as well. And I've friends who are still diplomats trying to raise good governance issues, trying to raise transparency and anti-corruption is exceedingly difficult for them to do in today's day and age. And some have been, it's been really pushed back in their face in terms of the transparency that we have in the United States now. So I think there's a huge policy difference of President Obama on those issues versus President Trump, for instance. But again, a different day, we'll schedule maybe a week and we'll invite everybody and we'll go through it play by play.
That sounds good. Well, we're up against time. I know we have happy hour after, we can all continue chatting. There was a question I didn't get to that I wanted to, that was about educating Americans about the diversity of Africa. And as my contribution to that, I thought I would end on asking you all for your favorite film or your favorite musical artist from an African country. Is that putting you too much on the spot?
I'm a big Hugh Masekela fan.
Aha. Very good.
Mine's always The Gods Must Be Crazy.
Okay. Very good.
I like Youssou N'Dour.
Perfect. All right. We'll end on that. Thank you all, and thank you for an excellent program.
Thank you very much for having us.
Okay.
Nice again. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, thank you for having us.